Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. I'm pretty sure you've heard this many times that Muslim Arabs back hundreds of years ago, they took black African slaves out of Africa and they used them as just the way the white colonialists did. And so they try and say, look, don't bag the colonials for doing the same. You Muslims did the same, and they try and claim that the Arabs did that. And so I wanted to confront a person to see if he can actually show me evidence to that. And watch how he actually gets busted. His name is Namal al-Chowdhury. He says, Africans are being traded as slaves by Arab Muslims for 1400 years, and you're telling me this? And I said to him, can you show us any academic, unbiased historical journal that is credible of colonial-style slavery done by Arabs towards the Africans? I can assure you, if that happened, Muslim countries would have built their countries to advancements hundreds of years ago, way before the white settlers, using black people to build their country like we see in America. Namal al-Chowdhury says, Muhammad started the biggest slave trade chain of human history named Arab slave trade, which resulted in the bloody slave rebellion in human history named Zanj Rebellion. Muhammad abolished slavery for freedom, Muslims, and instituted enslaving the kuffar, men, women, and children, which resulted in slave shortage. Arabian encouraged Muslims to invade kuffar lands and enslave their women and children. Africa was an easy source for mining slaves, which resulted the worst enslavement of human history, import Africa virgins, blah, blah, blah. Okay. He said, Muslim Arab countries are the last to abolish slavery. They refused to abolish it until 1960 because it was their religious culture. Although they abolished it officially in the 60s, they still practiced it officially. Every Bangladeshi men and women, workers, whoever went to Middle East, faced enslavement by the kafir, which is modified version of slave master. Every woman who went to Middle East was sexually assaulted. Okay. I said to him, I didn't ask you about right-hand possessions, concubines, and taking prisoners of war as slaves. I asked you to show where colonial-style slave trade was ever practiced by Islamist Arabs. Can you quote a credible source for your assertion? There is no evidence that Arabs took Africans without war and took them the outside war, and took them as sexual slaves and cut up their vaginas, because he was saying, they cut up their vaginas and things like that. Quote academic references, last chance. He says, colonials are the people who abolished slavery and Muslims are the people who established slave trade. Still adopt it officially. Colonials are innocent if we compare them with the Arabs. Colonials learned it from the Muslims, blah, blah, blah. He said, you little follower, slave trader, child rapist. So he goes into child pedophilia and all this nonsense about the Prophet. And they bring up pedophilia when they get caught out. They can't refute and bring up evidence and proof, so they bring up child rape. I said to him, because he brought up the case of, how there are underpaid workers in Saudi Arabia and there are human abuses that are going on. And I said to him, there are unpaid abusers of systems in all cultures and in every country. I asked, where is the evidence of a universal decision by a Muslim sovereign state to take Africans out of Africa or from any other nation where they took these slaves in order to exploit them? Quote your source, final chance. Saying Muhammad was a child rapist isn't evidence to the Arab slave trade like colonial-style trade mythology. He said, the Quran is a source of slave trade chain, nothing else needed when it is the Quran, Hadith, Surah itself. Africans became the victim because they were comparative easy targets. I said to him, the Quran, you may presume, teaches colonial-style slavery, but that's irrelevant. What you think the Quran states. I asked physical implementation of those apparent verses upon the African people by a sovereign Islamic state. He then says the Quran itself permits Muslims to enslave people. Isn't it that a universal source you follow of child rape? He says, what else could be more universal source? I said, this is final warning. The next post of yours without academic backing will definitely result of you being permanently blocked. Show us these verses being physically implemented in Africa by a sovereign Islamic state. And I started counting from 1 to 10. He goes, what does it mean physically implemented, you follower of child? He said, these verses and hadith construct the Islamic slave trade and invasion of Africa. And I said to him, goodbye. And he goes, you follower of Muhammad. So, as you can see, folks, he couldn't provide a single reference, an academic reference, where apparently those Muslims took that Quran interpretation and physically implemented it into the slave trade of Africans. All he could say is apparently the Quran teaches this, and we know that the Quran, as he claims, does not teach it. Visit the hyperlinks below this video. You'll see that there is no such thing as colonial style slavery within the hadith literature, within Islam. You can see I'll put 3 hyperlinks below this video refuting the claim that the slaves, according to Islamic methodology, was the same slave trade methodology according to the way the colonialists did it. It is totally contradictory. And I'll put hyperlinks below this video, and you can see the treatment of slaves in Islam compared to the treatment of slaves in colonialism. And when I asked him for academic proof, physical implementation, he claims, oh, it's in the Quran. No, nowhere in the Quran does it speak about academic historical references where Muslims went into the slave trade of Africa and took those Africans as slaves. It doesn't say that in the Quran. He claims that there is evidence in the Quran of slaves. Well, there may be. It may talk about slaves in the Prophet Muhammad's time, some of the treatments, but that doesn't speak about the slave trade in Africa, what Muslims apparently did, ordered by a sovereign state in Arabia. There is no evidence for that. As for the slave trade ending in 1960s in Arabia, well, that wasn't the colonial slave trade. It has no relevance. What may have ended was the practices that they used to do when they would take war captives through slavery. And now we have different systems such as taking those captives and putting them in prisons and so forth. So they may have ended the concubine slave trade due to war and so forth. And that is explained in the video below. I'll put a hyperlink below and you can see the treatment of concubines and so forth. And that is totally irrelevant to what we're actually discussing here. And the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, in the 1960s, there was no evidence. I mean, you could bring up academia, you could bring up references. I'm asking you to bring those references where there were actual slaves there. You know, you've got all these pictures taken, these Arabs, you know, they've got these black African women in chains and they've, you know, prostituting them around. There's no evidence of that happening. Okay, so please do not even conflate this 1960 law to end slavery. It is totally bogus and has absolutely no relevance to apparently these Muslims going into Africa, taking these slaves, then exploiting them, building their country, raping them, whipping them and trying to build Saudi Arabia. This is absolutely nonsense and it has got no relevance to Africa. And when he couldn't prove it, when he couldn't show evidence, academic evidence of Muslim, a sovereign state, going into Africa and implementing the Quran and the Hadith and saying, we're taking, we're stealing 30,000 slaves, we're bringing them back to Arabia and we're going to make them slaves and we're going to whip them and we're going to beat them up and we're going to we're going to make them work for our country, and, we're going to sexually exploit them and rape them. They can't even show a single academic, historical paper, unbiased report of that. And when I asked him for that, he basically started insulting my prophets. There you go.